Welcome back to another episode of Recorrelated Podcast. I am one of your co-hosts, Natalie Baker. Today, I have a very special guest with me. We kind of started the year off talking to Jacob Hill, the founder of GRC Academy. Really great subject matter expert in specifically CMMC, but other compliance frameworks, risk management, all of that. General, got your master's in 6 days or something, I believe you said last time. So very impressive, and just all around rock star. Very kind of you to come back and join us again, Jacob. If you would like to give yourself any more of an introduction, absolutely have at it.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. And hey, everybody, I am Jacob Hill, as she said, and started out my career in IT, and then most of my career has been around Department of Defense, and got my start in, I guess, information assurance, information security, as it was known back then, in about 2015, and have been in the cyber area ever since. Was able to do some work in NIST RMF, helping government systems get ATOs, and then I jumped onto a corporate security role doing NIST 800-171 and of course CMMC. So I've been focused on that corporate security role for the last, I think, maybe 4 years, and learned a lot through it, definitely. And also I run GRC Academy on the side right now, and I'm pretty excited about that because I think it really could blow up. We'll see. But I have CMMC training for defense contractors, as well as ISO 27001, other ISOs out there, GDPR, and all those things. So thank you again for having me on. I really appreciate it.
I'm so happy to have you back. It's kind of cool that we get to see the progress that CMMC, and we were talking about this backstage a little bit earlier, to see the progress that has been made in 1 year with CMMC. Before, right. I made the joke before, and I've made this joke before numerous times, but I used to be the person that the minute somebody brought up CMMC years ago, I would just walk away from the conversation because we were not at a point and nobody was making realistic strides. And in this past year, I think that perception has completely shifted, and we're treading in the right direction as a industry as a whole. What are your thoughts on it? What are your hot takes on CMMC, the final rule, and where we're headed to?
Yes. So the CMMC final program rule went actually effective. I think it was on the 16th, a few days ago. And so what that means is that here soon, CMMC assessments are going to be able to begin. There was a slight complication with the cyber accreditation body, who's over the third-party assessors. They're not going to be ready until, I think, January 2nd. So January 2nd and on, CMMC assessments will be happening. It has been such a long time, as you said. I think CMMC, I first heard it spoke about in 2019. And of course, there's been the foundation, was NIST 800-171, and that had been around before then. But as we all know, it's defense contractors haven't been great at adopting it. They just say, yeah, we got a perfect score, it's great. And then they get assessed by a government entity, and it's awful, terrible, right? So CMMC is bringing in those third-party assessments, and it's about to start, so it's very exciting. I just had a conversation, I think you were able to catch that podcast you mentioned, with Joy Beeland, and just released that episode today about MSPs, IT managed service providers. And when I was writing up the description, I was thinking to myself, and I actually got a really, just real serious, because managed service providers are going to be a huge weakness across the defense industrial base. And I really do think that probably 90% of them are not ready, and probably most of them shouldn't even be supporting defense contractors, and they have no business to, because you can't dip your toe in the CMMC waters and get away with it, because they'll have to be part of that CMMC assessment, and then they'll have to have another document called a customer responsibility matrix documenting all the controls and the responsibility they take care of, and then the customer takes care of. And that just came out in the October final program rule. And so Summit 7 has been talking about a shared responsibility matrix for a while, right? They've been on board with that. And then it was interesting to see that actually come out in the regulation. But like, buyer beware, I think that a lot of people are going to be surprised because they're going to say, yeah, my managed service provider just takes care of all of it. No problems. I think there's going to be a lot of failures because of that. So it's kind of scary.
I think that a lot of people are going to have to shift into that supply chain risk management mindset. And you're seeing it more being implemented, not just in CMMC, but also even in FedRAMP, like Rev 5. From Rev 4 to Rev 5, we started seeing we have more than just like a couple of controls that really talk about or encompass something referencing close to supply chain management. Now we have a whole control family surrounding it and ensuring that you're doing the responsible thing and you're actually paying attention to what you're allowing and to be part of your boundary. Who has access to your information? What kind of information do they have access to? So I think you're going to start to see that mindset shift towards that, and I think that's good.
Yes.
I think good transition for us to move forward with as an industry, because like that is the weakness. That's what attackers are going to utilize to their advantage. That's what used to keep me up at night, right?
Yeah. Right. Without a doubt.
So I think it's good to have those conversations. I do have a slightly different take on it. And I do get when you reference like the mindset of like a lot of these MSSPs or MSPs are not going to be ready for it. I think there is something to be said for somebody that actually has an MSSP versus just doing the MSP portion. And you're right, the customer responsibility matrix, it sounds so scary, but you literally do that in your SSP anyway. You've already declared it in your SSP. So literally all you're doing is copying it into a different format and a different viewpoint. And explaining what those responsibilities are, right? What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that a lot of companies are going to have issues with the customer responsibility matrix? I think the more important thing is going to be the SSP and correctly implementing an SSP and getting those written for these MSSPs.
Yeah. I think you're right. So, I mean, the bottom line is if they don't have an SSP to start with, that's the big problem, right? And I think that honestly, defense contractors just need to do their due diligence and they need to be educated themselves to be able to ask these right questions. You know what I mean? Because it's very, very simple to kind of figure out as long as the MSP is telling you the truth, right? Are you going to be ready? What's your CMMC readiness? You know what I mean? You can ask some pretty good questions and and if they give you, as Joy said, the deer in the headlights look, maybe move on to the next one. Because like you said, I mean, MSPs out there that have been paying attention, they have that documentation available. Maybe they don't have the CRM yet, but yeah, it's a great point. It's not that difficult to derive from your SSP and make some modifications here and there. But yeah, it's I just think really high percentage of MSPs, they see CMMC as a new service line. They're like, this is awesome. This is all, we can jump into this. This will be great. But they just don't understand it,
Yeah, and I do understand. I do 100%. And anybody who is in the comments watching this, if anybody's watching this live, please hop the comments. Let us know what your thoughts are.
Yeah,
give us
definitely.
your questions, shoot them over. We'd love to have them live as we're recording. But I think that it really just depends, because I have like Joy said, like there are a lot of MSSPs out there that they just don't know what right is.
Yeah.
Like they don't know. And honestly, like when I worked because before I came to my current position, I worked at an MSSP running the security operations center. And it was really comes down to is how much more overhead's going to be on your operations team that's already doing so much and already overwhelmed. And how are you going to displace that and like make that easier for them? To utilize their expertise. And how do you actually become your own customer? Because I've noticed that the MSSPs out there, that they are their own customer, they're not going to have that much of a problem with this.
Yeah. I certainly hope so. Maybe I have a dimmer view than I should, but I've talked to some people specifically less about MSSPs and more about the MSPs that are just Wild West and, flying by the
Yeah,
seat of their pants and just hammering the keyboard and like, yay, it's fixed. But they don't,
they're
they
just
might be
doing
signing up
support.
for more than they realize. You know what I mean?
They're not actually doing your sysadmin work. They're just doing
Exactly.
support. Yeah. Yeah, and honestly what worries me is the defense contractors that don't know what questions to ask
Yes.
of an MSSP before they're even engaged with an MSSP, and then they're finding out, like, as they're going through their audit, that now they're going to fail because their MSSP can't hold up the bargain.
Hmm.
And what kind of data does that MSSP have access to? Is this
Hmm.
something that, like, I have heard that there are some MSSPs out there that have gone through and gotten like FedRAMP so that they can actually support
Hmm.
systems
Yeah.
at a FedRAMP level. Are we going to see that happening as well, where like they're able to inherit portions of that from their MSSP's CRM, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. 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 That's fascinating. There was one I was aware of. I can't recall the name of, but they have a FedRAMP platform and they're an MSSP, like you said. I was like, wow, that's interesting. And
Yeah.
now that the regulation is out, they can see if that helps them or not, from a CMMC standpoint. So yeah, lots of change. Very, very interesting for sure. And I have a second hot take if you're ready for that.
Oh, I'm ready for it. Let's
All
go.
right, let's go. I think, and maybe this is not a hot take, but I really do think that the phase in is going to be extremely rough. And the reason why I think that is because the government side, because NIST 800-171 CMMC, it's all about the regulated information. What is that? Well, federal contract information and controlled and classified information. But the government doesn't seem to know what that is, and they either overmark because they're not sure what's actually is the CUI. And federal contract information is a little bit gray. The definition just says that it's anything. Basically, I'm paraphrasing heavily here, but it basically says that, well, it's public, it's not information that's publicly available. And so assumedly everything that's not marked as CUI is federal contract information. Okay. But the problem with that, and I'm concerned about small businesses that are just relying on CMMC level 1 and they think they'll be okay with that, those 15 security controls. I'm concerned because if the government doesn't understand the differentiator between this is CUI over here and this, we're really comfortable with this is the federal contract information over here. you know if they don't know that, they're just going to overmark and they're going to just require CMMC level 2. Now, whether that's a certification required or a self-assessment, I mean, we'll find out and we'll figure out what that criteria is later. But the difference, as between CMMC level 1, level 2, 15 security controls, 110 security controls, it's very, very, very large. And I just am worried that we're not going to see CMMC level 1 used nearly as much as it should be, because they haven't they themselves haven't really been trained very well. I think the DoD is working on training to help them mark correctly. And then the other problem with the primes, right? Because if the government doesn't know what type of information they're passing down and they just assume it's CUI, and we've seen performance work statements and opportunities marked CUI, top and bottom of the document across the entire 50, 100-page document. And I'm like, okay, so where is the CUI in this document? And if the government doesn't use specific markings like portion markings and helping us understand, then the primes are not going to be able to say, all right, I've got this diagram or this spec, and this specific piece of it is CUI. So I'm going to take that for myself. I'm going to pass down the rest, which is federal contract information, down my supply chain so that they only have to be, CMMC level 1. That's not going to be able to be, that can't happen because the government isn't marking correctly. And so I think we're going to see a few things. One of which is the government, because they don't know, right? They haven't been trained effectively yet. They won't be able to mark correctly, which has downstream effect of the primes won't be able to flow down information, other than CMMC level 2 information. And that's going to have a huge impact on the small businesses that are supporting them, the one person shops or whatever. So, I mean, maybe the primes will have to provide enclaves for them inside of their own environments. We've heard of Army providing a, something called encode. I haven't seen too much about that. But I think the other question is, well, how we've got 300,000 companies. You know what I mean? I think they say 80,000 will handle CUI, but the rest, in theory, maybe CMMC level 1 folks, that's a lot of people for the government to provide an environment for. I don't think that's
Yeah.
realistic. You know what I
No,
mean?
not
So we got this
scalable.
big problem, the regulated information, but what is it? We're not sure. So everything is CUI. You know what I mean? It's a difficult problem. I think the phase in is going to be very, very rocky, especially in phase 1. And I do think that we're going to see protests, a lot of protests, because the government is they're just going to require CMMC level 2 because they're not sure. And then you got the contractor saying, wait a minute, there's no CUI involved, because you're providing us with government furnished equipment and all the CUI is going to stay inside of your environment. I'm going to protest this thing, and I think that's going to happen quite a lot until the government gets their hands around this. So it's definitely going to have some big impacts. But I mean, this type of change, it's hard. Change is hard, Yeah, it's just where we are.
It is, and you just kind of have to hope that it's going in the right direction for the right result for the right reason, right? Like,
Yeah.
because like the ultimate goal is to protect our nation secrets at the end of the day, right? Like, and I mean,
Yeah.
not necessarily nation secret, but anything that could be considered like confidential information, right? So
Yes.
like, just making sure that that's safeguarded appropriately, and I think that is a worthwhile conversation to be having. And I think that like you're going to see those struggles at the beginning, and
Mhm.
at the end of it, you're going to come out in a much better place. Like, I
Mhm.
mean, you've seen so like even in the FedRAMP world, you see through the iterations that have come through the change in the progression that has happened from
Mhm.
even like 2 to 3 years ago to now. It's dramatic, but in a good way. And they're asking the right questions. So like it
Mhm.
gets people's minds wrapped around that more continuously, I feel. Um,
Yeah.
so what do you think the timelines are that people should be aware of currently?
Yeah. So obviously the program rule that coming is a very big deal. Now, what's next is the rulemaking process to complete for the contractual clause for CMMC to be updated, DFARS 7021, 252, 204, 7021. And once that is complete, then the DoD will begin the phase in of CMMC. That'll be phase 1. What's interesting is that it was 6 months in the what was it called? The proposed rule back all the way back in December of 2023, right? They've increased that to a 12-month period. And phase 1 is basically just the beginning of CMMC, including that in your contracts, in your opportunity solicitations. So what that means is if you handle FCI CUI, you'll start to see CMMC level 1 and level 2 requirements, but only for self-assessment. But for the most part, okay,
Yeah,
it says that DoD has the ability at their discretion to include CMMC level 2 certification requirements in phase 1.
contracts.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so people should be looking at the contract renewals that are happening and making
Uh-huh.
sure that they're reading that language to make sure that they are not required to actually have the actual assessment this year. Like,
That's exactly right. And they can also, at their discretion, at option periods, when those are exercised, require CMMC level 2 certification. Now, the government isn't going to shoot themselves in the foot. You know what I mean? Or
yeah,
they might, I mean, they quote unquote might if there's an opportunity to. I mean, I guess they just wouldn't exercise the option if the contractor wasn't performing. They could use that as an additional factor, I guess. But yeah, they have the discretion, CMMC level 2 certification at the time of award or during the exercise of options. But for the most part, it's going to be CMMC level 1, level 2 self-assessment requirements. Now, here's the interesting thing about this. Guess who is responsible for determining the CMMC level requirement for a opportunity? It's the DoD program manager for that activity.
Okay.
So there's no central office or program responsible for doing this. All the PMs throughout DoD have the ability to do this. This is why I'm saying it's going to be a mess. It's going to be a true mess.
I could foresee where like having some real good training for these even like the people that are these program managers to go to and utilize would be very helpful for them because they're going to be left in the air like being like, I don't know, I'm just project managing things here.
Yes. And I think some training is coming. I know DAU is working on something. And DoD, obviously, they're working on some training for helping them to mark correctly. But yeah, it's interesting. I don't know when that training is coming. So
data classification, it's important.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Okay, so they can put in contracts. Obviously, the better, if with any government entity, the better of a relationship that you have with that AO, that you can actually kind of have these discussions in advance, the better off you're going to be. So getting that direct line of contact, I think, is a good first step, right? What would your opinion be on that?
Yeah, definitely keep an eye on the government industry days for the agencies that you're going to be supporting, like the branches. Show up at those industry days, attend those, because that's where they'll probably be telling you,
Okay.
Well in advance of a contract coming out, an RFI or an RFP, RFQ stage. That is, like I said, that's going to be very interesting. I'm sure that the government will be accepting. We'll see, but I would think that they would accept some recommendations. If they're saying this is going to be CMMC level 2 and this is what's going to be evolved at the RFI stage, I would think that if you were able to respond and say, well, since you said, like my example before, since you said you're providing government furnished equipment to us, if we keep all the CUI inside of your systems, CMMC really level 1 is fine, so it's something to keep an eye on especially for your business development people. We cyber people, we can't operate in an island. We have to integrate in with the business processes. Yep. We have to educate our own company on all of this, so that they understand and they know what to look for, and they can tell us, hey, there's this opportunity and actually it's a CMMC level 3, and it's like, oh, wow, I'm not sure about that one, because that has real high ramifications, but the basics of it is we have to make sure we're integrating in with our business processes, because we can't, especially when it comes to, and I mean, this, we can't succeed without the rest of the business being on board, right? Yep. Over time, in order to maintain compliance, it's not all about us. Our users are involved as well. So we have to educate them too.
Yeah. And I think the more that you can spend time educating those in your organization on like what the next best steps are, the better you're going to be. And like having those conversations early on, not waiting till next year when you have the award to be like, oh, maybe we should start looking into CMMC. That's probably going to be a little too late at that point. Yeah. When do you think, we thought about phase 1, which is going to be mainly self-assessment, which I feel that you're 100% correct. Based on it being a self-assessment, it's going to be a whole dumpster fire. It's going to be a bit rocky, because I can foresee a lot of companies just saying, yep, we do this. Yeah, we do this. This is self-assessment. We sign off on this. And then the next year kind of getting slapped on the wrist by the government when they're requiring the assessment. What about you?
Yeah, definitely. Because in phase 2, because like I said, in phase 1, they still have the option to require CMMC level 2 certification at the time of exercising an option. In phase 2, that is actually when you'll start to see CMMC level 2 really across the board. And then they have discretion to require it only during option periods, which is actually pretty interesting. Um, I did see a post maybe yesterday I think it was yesterday that said there on sam.gov there was an opportunity, and it said that they actually were requiring the contractors who are responding to have their CMMC certification assessment scheduled. Not obviously not awarded or certified yet, but just having it scheduled. So that's something to think about too. I
Did
don't
they
know if that's
have
going to
like
become
a
a common thing, but it's interesting.
I could foresee it having like to be scheduled within the next year, being a realistic expectation of the federal government that they should
Yeah.
be able to have. And what are your thoughts about like hiring like a C3 PAO during the phase 1 to kind of give you that like initial mock assessment, or like hiring like a consultant to come in and give you like an initial mock assessment so that you kind of know what to expect? Like, do you think that would be a smart move or smart strategy for organizations, or
I'd highly
what are your thoughts
recommend
on
it.
it?
I'd highly recommend it, especially if you are starting from scratch or near ground zero. You know what I mean? Because if you haven't made progress and like aren't 70% of the way, and you're just starting, oh, you gotta get in, you gotta move, you gotta move so
Yeah.
fast, and so that means you're gonna have to spend more money. You're gonna have to spend money faster, right? You're gonna have to bring in, like you said, the C3 PAO to do a mock assessment to just figure out where your gaps are. Because there are, aside from the very, very small companies out there, there are a lot of companies that, 100 plus employees, they do have some security in place. You know what I mean? They can afford IT people, they can afford a few cyber folks. So they probably do have, maybe they're even ISO 27001 or, something else. So those do contribute, but you got to understand what your gaps are. And a real good way to do that, like you said, C3PAO mock assessment, just come in, assess me, tell me what I need to do. Or, I mean, they're not going to be, it's kind of weird. I haven't read the version 2 of the CAP yet, but I think even in a mock assessment, they're still not, if they're a C3 PAO, they're still not able to tell you much beyond, you failed. So, I mean, maybe even working with a consultant, an RPO that has a CCA, CMMC certified assessor on staff is the right thing to do, because C3PAOs, I think, are more limited in what they can tell you, even if it's a mock assessment. Now, don't take my word for it because I'm not sure about that. Like I said, I haven't read the version 2 of the CAP yet. So, but yeah, I would definitely recommend doing something like that for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know like I currently have been delving into like the FedRAMP, and like the first thing that we do when we bring somebody in that we're taking from like nothing to get to where they need to get to is we
Mhm.
do a gap assessment. We're like, okay, and we just kind of like run through the whole litany, and it's a very long and tedious process, but it will tell you what you have in place and what you
Yeah.
don't really quick, and where you need to grow at, and what capability you need to grow, what kind of people you need to hire in for your business, so that you can relay that up the chain so that they actually know where these funds need to be allocated to.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, and it's interesting too because on the FedRAMP side, typically you're going to be working with. I mean, you can tell us your experience, but I would think that you would have more mature organizations, that are coming to you because they want to work for the government. Maybe not in all cases, but for CMMC, I mean, it's the one person business. It's all the way through the 80,000, 50,000 employee business. So it's quite a range.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you see in software development specifically those that are working towards cloud, you do see lean and sometimes some younger teams as well. You
Mhm.
have those startups, or maybe
Mhm.
they've been around for a while, but they just decided to move to this side of this venture or whatnot.
Mhm.
So you do have some very lean teams that you're used to working with. So it's not all like, sometimes when you get lucky, you get a really mature organization and you're like, great, this is awesome. Like, we're not starting from scratch all the time. But I mean, you have to be able to work with anybody that you get that comes through your door, right?
Yeah, sure.
So you're working with like all different types of companies, all different types of backgrounds of like knowledge that from that company of like what resources they actually have on staff versus what they have to hire. So you see, I
Hmm.
think it's kind of cool because you do see a lot of the innovation and the innovative thoughts that happen on that side. And then you're like, okay, but now we need to tamper that down with securing it. And they're like, well, you're kind of blocking our innovation. And we're like, yeah, I'm sorry. We have to kind of tame it a little bit.
Right. Yeah, that's right. That's right. I'm, DoD CIO, they put out the LinkedIn post about CMMC, the program rule, going effective and all these things. And you had some companies out there who were, who said this is going to kill small business and all these things. And I think it will knock some out of the supply chain, and that's really unfortunate. Hopefully the Army and other agencies can create something, or the primes can create something, an enclave for those really small subs that are critical to the supply chain. But on one side of it, it's like, where have you been since 2017? This stuff is a lot easier to handle if you're doing it over 7 years opposed to right now all at once.
Well, I will say that 171 3-4 years ago was not 171 now. And it is not the same quality of like you saw 171 just recently uplift to their newest version, and it very closely mimics NIST 853, and it was never really that closely mimicking. It was very loosely defined before, so like you do kind of have that little bit of a shock factor added into it. I think that for a lot of
Yeah.
companies, it's that extra and those extra like little requirements that are now we have to define what we're doing, what frequency we're doing this at, or our agency needs to define it. And I think a
Yes.
lot of agencies are going to have a problem defining it,
Yes.
what they
Yes.
want these customer values to be. What are your
Right.
thoughts about that aspect of it?
Yeah,
How
that's
wild
very
can get?
that's very interesting. So since 2017, contractors with what are called covered systems, that means you have DoD CUI on your systems, are required to implement NIST 171 revision 2, right? Of course, NIST came out with revision 3, I think earlier in the summer, and the final version came out. Now, the thing about that is the DoD issued something called a class deviation, which I'm not a contracting person, so it basically it just means that DFAR 7012 says the current version of 80171, which is revision 2. The class deviation says, yeah, we actually mean revision 2, not the current version. So for the next maybe year or two, probably 2 years, we'll be stuck on NIST 80171 revision 2. Now, with that said, the march towards revision 3 is on, right? So defense contractors really should think about future proofing for revision 3. I'm hoping to have someone from NIST on the podcast to talk about exactly that, like what does the upgrade path look like from revision 2 to revision 3. So that'll be a very interesting conversation. Now, I can say this because I saw Stacy Boshanek from DoD CIO say it on another podcast, because I interviewed her and I'm waiting for
Nice.
the review process to be complete, but she said it on another one, so I can repeat it. She said that they have an ODP working group that has been working on populating the ODPs. And I don't know if she said the status, so you have to wait till mine comes out, if they let me keep it in. But they've been working on that, and the rulemaking process has started. So they're marching towards revision 3, and I was very surprised to hear they're already working on those ODPs, which I'm happy about. And I can't really say too much more because the episode's not out yet. And so, but they're working on it. It's going to be an interesting thing. But like I said, from a defense contractor standpoint, we really need to start looking at revision 3, planning ahead, because if we have to make changes to our environment that cross that threshold of making us have a new certification assessment, that's no fun because we got to pay out
Yeah.
again.
Well, and I think that we also need to start with like understanding what the environment actually entails because
Mhm,
like for some small companies maybe not every tool that you utilize like QuickBooks is not going to necessarily be
mhm.
a part of your boundary. It's just
That's
not.
right.
It might be a business tool that you use, but it's not going to be a part of your boundary,
That's right.
right? But like other tools like G Suite or Microsoft Office, those are part of your boundary. So like really defining what that boundary is, what's protecting things coming in and out, how data's moving within, because that's like a big thing that I've noticed and I've learned through my years of GRC now that I can say years plural experience is like it's comes down to with federal compliance, it comes down to how data is moving throughout an environment, where it's moving to,
Yes.
who has access to that data, how that data is secured in transit and in storage. And
Mhm.
do you think FIPS is now going to like how much? So I'm worried that when we go to Rev 3 for NIST 800 171, we're going to see a huge shift towards FIPS 140 2, or what will then become soon going to be released FIPS 140 3, right? How I don't think a lot of small businesses are going to be able to handle that aspect of it necessarily. Um, do you think we're going to be relying mainly on inheritance of other like CSPs?
Yes, yes, I do. I do. I don't see DoD. I could be surprised, but I don't see DoD going away from FIPS compliance requirements. And FIPS is just a whole nother layer of, of squirrel rabbit hole action there in itself. So the base. Do you mind if I just explain FIPS real quick for folks?
Nope, not at all. Have at
All right.
it.
All right. So NIST runs two programs that I'll speak to, and I'm gonna look them up so I can actually tell you what the acronyms mean. But they have the the CMVP. I always mix it up.
Yep. Yep.
CVMP, the CMVP, Cryptographic Module Validation Program, and then they have the CAVP, the Cryptographic Algorithms Validation Program. And so they certify algorithms and then modules, which is like open ssl, that type of thing. There's if you start looking at some of these modules, you'll see funny names like bouncy castle and all these different things that have been validated by NIST as to meet the standards of FIPS 140 tac 2 or tac 3. And so the interesting piece about this, because I had a experience early on with this FIPS compliance versus FIPS validated conversation. And what I learned is that most products are FIPS compliant. So, for example, if you look at SharePoint Online, SharePoint is not FIPS validated, right? They use cryptographic modules, the Microsoft cryptographic modules that are FIPS validated. So the platform SharePoint sitting on top of that using that module is SharePoint itself is FIPS compliant, right? And so many times if you're looking at a like Windows operating system, you have to enable a setting in order for it to run in something called FIPS mode, which makes sure that it runs according to that spec. If you don't do that, and this is kind of interesting because if you're talking about BitLocker encryption, if you don't push that setting first before the encryption runs, then you actually have to decrypt it and then re-encrypt it. But from what I recall, it's very difficult to determine if the encryption that was done was FIPS. So, but for the most part, the cloud service providers, Microsoft, the Googles out there, they're going to take care of that for you. Do your research, make sure that it's all taken care of. But I know that is one that seems to bite a lot of defense contractors during assessments.
I think that what worries me is that I am pretty technical literate. And like I have spent the better part of like 2.5 years learning the ins and outs. Like I'm not like an encryption guru or anything, but I have
Me either.
learned the ins and outs of tips. Let me tell you, because you only get burnt in an assessment like one time and you're like, no, 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 we are never doing this again. I will know my FIPS cryptographic modules that we are using and we're referencing. So you learn really, really fast. And it's like a lot of people forget MFA is also requiring you have to have MFA that also supports FIPS
Mm,
on the endpoint device. And what I've found is that there are some MFAs that they are FIPS validated for
mhm,
a Apple device, right? Because they're using that underlying Apple
mhm,
cryptographic module.
mhm,
But
mhm,
Android, they don't have that cryptographic module on the Android side for
mhm,
like
mhm,
the high enough level to meet the requirements of like a moderate assessment or something
mhm,
like that. So like
mhm.
being very careful that, and even if you are using MFA, making sure that you're getting the government version of that
Yeah.
tool that you're utilizing, because that can also be something that is a painful thing to find out during the middle of an assessment.
Yeah, you're using Microsoft Commercial. What?
And sometimes it is okay to use commercial products because there are commercial products that if they're configured properly and you do the
Yeah.
right things with them, you can absolutely configure a commercial product to be, compliant. But you have to know what you need to configure too. So, like again,
Yes.
it all comes back to your customer responsibility matrix that you would get from that CSP or that tool.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And what's funny is that these requirements, like DFAR 7012 itself, it has a ton of requirements in there. C through G is all about incident response activities and like damage assessment, that DoD process where they come in and look at the information that was actually compromised to determine the impact to that program. There is so much in that, but it's in a whole line of contract clauses. You know what I mean? So I do feel bad for the average business out there that says, "Yes, I won this contract. It's amazing." And they see all of these FAR, blah, 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 blah. There's like 50 of them, DFARs, and they're not going to, probably, they're not going to look at that. You know what I mean? And so I don't know. I don't really know how I feel about it overall. It's just like, could DoD have done a better job of communicating this to the industry? Maybe. I don't know. It's tough because you got all kinds, like I said, I mean, the one person, two people, 10 people, they don't have counsel on staff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just a tough situation. But it's gonna
Yeah.
get better. It's just gonna get better.
Yeah.
It's gonna be rough, but it is gonna get better.
We have faith. We have faith
Yes.
here. We believe in positive impact here. Positive affirmations, we will make it true. I do agree. I think that at first it's gonna be, and I saw with your podcast with Joy Beeland, she even said that they were like for like small businesses that like just don't have the ability to accrue this much technical debt of like now we have to hire entire cybersecurity teams that specialize in this to help us even understand what our requirements are and what we have to
Mhm,
do. And then somehow on top of everything else that we're supposed to do within our contract realms, we now have to do X, Y, and Z extra to make sure that the data is secure.
mhm,
I did see that she said that they have like been working closely with like legislation or legislators to kind of get some type of like tax break for small businesses that really can't take in this. Do you foresee, what are your thoughts on it? I think it's a great thing to see that happening and to see those conversations being had because it's those businesses that I think are going to feel the heaviest hit.
Yeah, 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 for sure. And there was, and I'm actually trying to pull it up here. There was a bill that I think was proposed for exactly that. It was a tax break for, I think I believe they called it super like micro small businesses, that type of thing. But it was a tax credit. I think it was up to $50,000 basically, and for expenses that these small businesses incur on, I think, CMMC prep, CMMC assessments, all those things. So that is, we'll see where that goes, but I think that's an excellent idea. And I don't know if that would be, I really don't know where that would fall. Like the DoD has the NDAA, right? I'm not sure where exactly this was proposed. The reason I mentioned that is because the NDAA, I think, was recently passed. So
Yeah.
I don't know that that was part of it, but yeah, I think we've got to become very, we just got to come up with some creative solutions here. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think I'm going to be speaking with the Small Business Administration Advocacy Office on my podcast here, maybe January, February. And they were the ones who were tasked with, on behalf of small businesses, responding to the DoD, you know? So I'm interested to see what they have, like what ideas they have to make these things better. So yeah, it'll be interesting. Like I said, I mean, small businesses, they're a huge part of the defense supply chain. We gotta figure out how to make this work for them, but also protect the information.
Yeah. Yeah. I would agree. I think that yeah, I think that what strategies would you be approaching coming into the next year of CMMC, knowing that like maybe the first year you're gonna have like a self-assessment, but then after that, like what other strategies that we haven't talked about would you recommend, especially for a company that maybe that, like, I know a lot of people on LinkedIn that follow me or follow this are probably very cyber related, but what about the ones that have nobody on their staff that knows anything about technology? What do you recommend for those contractors? Like, where should they be looking at, and what should their strategies and approaches be moving forward in the next
Yeah.
year?
Yeah. Well, I think it starts with educating yourself. So there are some resources out there. I'm one of them. I have training out there, but there are some other resources too. I think, you know, Project Spectrum is always mentioned. I don't know the quality of the training out there, but educate yourself in some way. You know, get a comprehensive overview of the different aspects of CMMC, of NIST 800-171, of your contractual requirements, because it all contributes and it all makes it one big problem for you. So you got to understand that. And then two, I would say, look at setting up some sort of CUI enclave. You know what I mean? There are, and I don't know too much about these solutions yet, but there are some solutions out there that I think ExoStar runs a CUI enclave. I think it's a managed CUI enclave. Miss Corinne Wise over at WTI Network, she's a CMMC assessor and a RPO as well. Well, not an RPO, she's a consultant. I believe. I'm hoping I'm not messing up her credentials. Sorry, Corinne. Super smart lady. She taught my CCP and CCA classes, so she's awesome.
Nice.
But yeah, she has a solution for an enclave. And what a CUI enclave means is that it's a small subset. It's a basically, so you got your entire network, right? And then you set up this thing over here. that's where you hold the
Dedicated.
CUI. Yeah.
That's where everything goes. And
Yes,
it
yes,
is probably one of the most protected spots in the network with like a lot of other protections around it.
yes,
Um,
yes.
yeah, it's generally one of the more protected areas.
Yes. And so the idea is that you can limit your cost by applying the 110 security controls to that enclave, and maybe ideally the level one on your main network. But if you don't have to do a whole 110 across your whole environment, that can help a lot. So that's what I would look at, and really limiting the scope down as much as possible, because the more systems that are in scope, the more you're going to have to apply those security controls to all those systems and everything. So finding good CMMC consultants to help you with that. Like I said, I know Corinne. She's awesome. There's some others. Derek Phillips is out there doing this work. Do you guys do the work too?
We are going to be, I'm sure.
Okay, all right.
Bring bring
Reach
your
out to
business
Natalie
our
also,
way.
so
I'm
there are
sure,
some
but
really
yeah.
good people. And then the other concern is that there are some people out there that are just getting into this business, but they don't understand it yet. But like I said, like the whole conversation with the MSPs, right?
Yeah.
If you all want to look at my podcast with Corinne Wise, it was earlier on. I don't remember what episode number it was, but we talked about interview questions for consultants. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
What should they be asking? What should you be asking to gauge their knowledge? Because, like I said, there are some consultancies out there to see CMMC as a new business line opportunity, and they're like, "Yes, we'll do this. This is great." One of the questions I would ask them is, all right, do you have CMMC certified professionals, CCPs, and a CCA, CMMC certified assessor? So many acronyms on staff.
Yeah.
And then asking them about NIST 800-171 and then NIST 800-171A. Do they know what A is and what it's used for? And that's what an assessor will use to evaluate your implementation of these security controls. And so
Yep.
what they should be doing is implementing and then self-assessing as they're going with
Mhm.
800-171 alpha.
Yeah.
There are some really easy questions that you can ask to kind of gauge the level of knowledge and level of expertise. Because it all goes back to that first point: educate yourself. You don't want to be led blindly around. That's the main thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like you said, there are a lot of great companies out there that are doing really great work that know like how the federal government looks at data and like
Mhm.
they really truly like, a company who has done FedRAMP before and that's like their meat and gravy and baked like their potatoes like CMMC is basically a little bit it's a watered down version of FedRAMP. Like you look
Mhm.
at it and you see FedRAMP and they're just like the government just comes through and they're like, here are all of your requirements that you now have to make these values that you used to be able to define, you are no longer allowed to define anymore because we defined them for you and this is what they will be.
Mhm.
And then you get a little bit away from that with the leniency a little bit in a CMMC because it's not as considered like, as confidential of data. So the classification of data is just a little bit different when you're talking about CUI versus like something that's actually secret.
Yes, yes. I would say there's a real benefit to coming from the FedRAMP or RMF side because you're already familiar with the way NIST writes their security controls and interpreting those and things like that. CMMC still is different though because obviously you have the contractual requirements that you got to understand and account for. Then you have the sole scope being on confidentiality of that
Yep.
CUI, and whereas with RMF, it's like you're looking at the system and securing the system, and in
Yep.
CMMC, it's scoped right based on the number of asset categories. So it
Yeah.
is different. And I was starting in this from an RMF background, and so originally I took that understanding, and just in the early research phases, my decisions were bad. Thankfully, it was at the research phase, right? But I knew
Yeah.
what I knew. I came from the RMF background, but NIST 800-171, it's a bit of a different animal. So just know that. Educate yourself. That's the key.
Yep. Awesome. Awesome. Um, all right. Anything else that we haven't talked about that you might want to like share about CMMC? Anything that I've missed?
Yeah, this has been an awesome conversation. One of the other changes I'd point out, this is also for the folks implementing the 15 or 17, depending on what version you're looking at of the security controls for CMMC level 1. Now it's 15. But that maps back to a contractual clause called FAR 52204-21. Those are the basic safeguarding requirements that are required to protect federal contract information. So, what's new for you folks that are going to be at CMMC level 1? Like I said, eventually, hopefully, that'll be used as it's intended to. But what's new is that you actually have to submit an annual affirmation of compliance, every year. If I remember right, for CMMC level 1, you have to do a reassessment every year and also an annual affirmation of compliance. And so before, you really weren't submitting any sort of score or anything like that. You weren't required to. For if you had FAR 52204-21, the government could have, included clauses that required a full score against the NIST 800-171, but that wouldn't be appropriate. But that's, they do stuff that's not appropriate at times. But in any case, that's different, right? So you'll have to submit your score. You'll have to be able to do, and there's no poems either. You cannot poem anything at CMMC level 1.
Oh,
And
okay.
you have to implement everything. And it's
Yeah, well, I
15.
mean, that makes sense. That tracks.
Yeah. So you have to implement everything. For CMMC level 2, there's a subset of controls that can be poemed, but if I'm remembering right, you have to have at least an 80% compliant score to be able to poem controls. So it's it's different, because before you were
Yeah,
allowed
that is
to
quite a bit different. Yeah.
yeah, before you could have poems, and really they didn't want you to put it 2099 in the implementation date, but you could. So now it's scoped. You can only have them on your poem for 6 months, and you actually have to close them out. So basically, if you have a C3PAO come in and do an assessment, and they say, okay, well, here's your poem. You've got to address these controls. You have 6 months to address those things. And then you got to call back the assessor and get them to come back and do
And
a
reassess.
closeout assessment.
Yep.
So you've
Yep.
got to really make sure you're doing things very quickly, because especially in
I mean, that's a
phase
very
1.
generous timeline that they gave you.
Ooh,
Those
yeah,
months
in
is a very
phase
generous
1.
timeline.
Yeah, in phase 1, C3PAOs are going to be slammed. So it might
Yeah.
be pretty difficult to get a C3PAO on board to do a closeout assessment. And if you don't, you have to do a new assessment. That's what I understand. So that could be
Wow.
rough. That could be rough.
Yeah. That could be really rough, especially for those poor C3PAOs that are just like overburdened with like back to back to back assessment. Be nice to your assessors.
Yeah, exactly.
They're probably tired.
I'm sure.
But yeah. Yeah, I think that's going to be the most interesting aspect, is how many assessors do we have out there versus how many companies need to be assessed
Yeah.
by an assessor, and how is that going to kind of pan out in the long run? Um, and I think you're right. Like if labeling is done right, that's not going to be as much of a problem with like level ones, because I think level ones, that's always going to be a self-assessment as far as I'm aware, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So like that's always just a self-assessment and an attestation. Now, obviously, don't lie in your attestations, because like we've seen plenty of lawsuits come down where like the federal government has come back and been like, hey, no. And you've seen it happen with a lot of like educational institutes that like
Yeah.
had labs and stuff, and they didn't implement certain controls or something, and they got their hands slapped. But like the same thing I foresee could happen. And that's kind of what those self attestations, to make sure that you do have all that implemented properly. But
Mhm.
for the ones that are going to require that C3PAO, if it's not labeled correctly, I now understand. Like I can now see how that would become very overburdening for the C3PAOs.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's going to be interesting. But like I said, it's going to be better. It's just going to be rocky getting to the point, but we have to do this, because you've got China, they're taking our information. Um, they're compromising our telecom infrastructure, like all these things. There was a thing about TP-Link that I saw today, that brand potentially being banned because it's being used as botnets and all those things. It's like, this is a war. You know what I mean? It's a
Yeah.
cyber war. We've got to take it seriously.
Yeah, I had Amanda Molina on a couple like last month, and we were talking about like quantum computing
Hmm.
and quantum in general, and and like how that's also very similar. Like it has to be taken seriously. Like these things have to, like, we have to make these like kind of considerations now before it's actually becoming a mainstream technology or whatnot, a capability that we have. But but we were talking about how like this is becoming everybody's responsibility to be part of this war. Like it used to be like you had your soldiers and you had your civilians, and now it's like everybody's part of this war landscape, and you don't know that you're part of it, but you probably are if you're working for a federal contractor.
Right. That's right.
So awesome, awesome. Well, any final thoughts, key takeaways that you want to, or was that it? I mean, you kind of gave a lot, but yeah.
I'm just excited about next year. For me personally, with GRC Academy, I'm excited to see where that goes. For everyone else, I hope you all have happy holidays, wonderful time, and are excited about the next year, and just experience growth and get through this bumpy time in defense contracting. But it's just going to get better. It's going to get better. So hang in there.
Yeah, let's plug. If you want to go learn more about CMMC or any of these frameworks, go look at GRC Academy and sign up for some courses. Help Jacob out with his side hustle, but also help yourselves out and become educated about what's going to be happening and what's coming down the pipeline and what it all means for you guys. You have great education out there, great content out there. So utilize those resources. Go out to his his website and make sure you check it out.
Thank you.
But yeah, thank you again for joining me, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. And we will chat all with everybody in the new year.
All right. Happy New Year, everybody.